They didn't storm the White House. They didn't seize Congress. They overthrew a city. On November 10th, 1898, armed white supremacists marched through Wilmington, North Carolina. They burned a black newspaper to the ground. They killed black residents. They forced elected officials to resign. Then they installed their own leader as mayor. This was not a riot. It was not spontaneous chaos. It was a coup. And it is often described as the only successful coup against an elected government in American history. America's darkest history is not a secret. It was often written down, signed off, and called necessary. It rarely began with monsters. It began with systems, excuses, and people who believed cruelty was the price of progress. In the 1890s, Wilmington was one of the most important cities in North Carolina. It was a port city, an economic center, and at the time, it had a black majority. Black citizens worked as police officers, craftsmen, business owners, doctors, lawyers, public servants, and elected officials. They built newspapers, churches, businesses, and political power. That power was tied to a movement called fusion politics. Fusion brought together black Republicans, and white populists. It was not perfect, but it was dangerous to the old ruling class because it proved something they could not tolerate. Poor white voters and black voters could sometimes build power together. That was the threat. Not crime. Not disorder. Democracy. The coup did not begin with gunfire. It began with propaganda. In 1898, North Carolina Democrats ran a statewide white supremacy campaign. Newspapers, speeches, cartoons, intimidation, and armed groups spread panic about black political power. One target was the Daily Record, a black-owned newspaper in Wilmington edited by Alexander Manly. Manly had challenged one of the central lies used to justify lynching: the claim that black men were uniquely dangerous to white women. He also pointed toward a truth white society did not want discussed, that sexual violence by white men against black women had been ignored for generations. White supremacists seized on his editorial. They twisted it. They reprinted it. They used it to inflame fear and rage. By election day, the message was unmistakable. If the ballot box did not restore white control, violence would. On November 8, 1898, Democrats swept the election after threats, intimidation, and fraud helped suppress black voters and fusion supporters. But even victory was not enough. 2 days later, hundreds of armed white men gathered in Wilmington. Their leader was Alfred Moore Waddell, a former Confederate officer and former U.S. congressman. The mob marched to the Daily Record. They broke in. They burned it. Then the violence spread through black neighborhoods. Families fled into hiding. Some escaped into cemeteries and swamps. The exact death toll is still uncertain. North Carolina's official report later used the figure as many as 60. Other estimates run higher. Then came the political purge. Wilmington's elected officials, black and white, were forced out. The mayor resigned under pressure. City officers were removed, and Alfred Waddell, one of the men who helped lead the mob, became mayor. Not by campaign, not by vote, by force. Afterward, the story was buried under a false label. White newspapers described it as racial disorder, as if black citizens had caused the violence. But the truth is much simpler. A democratically elected local government was overthrown. A black community was terrorized. A newspaper was destroyed. Elected officials were expelled. White supremacists took control. No one was prosecuted. And Wilmington changed. Black families were driven from homes, businesses, politics, and public life. North Carolina soon moved toward voting restrictions that helped crush black political power for generations. The Wilmington Coup was not just a local tragedy. It was a blueprint. First, tell people democracy has been stolen from them. Then define your neighbors as the threat. Then use violence to restore order. The most disturbing part is not that it happened once. It is that the method is still recognizable. Democracy does not only die when ballots disappear. Sometimes it dies after the ballots are counted, when powerful people decide they will not accept the result.